you, Noor, so much for an amazing opening. I'd like to invite Hiba and Rami, please, to discuss.
This is a very difficult moment and an amazing talk to follow, and it's also being back here. It's always been a pilgrimage for me to come back to City Debates. I'm a graduate of this program. I was sitting here for many years, like you guys, waiting for people to come and give us talks from all over the world, and it was so exciting. I also came out of age in this amazing school at the time that we were having our own destruction, and we were debating in the same room about like what's going to happen with downtown Beirut. What do you preserve? What do you construct? Solidar was already bulldozing everything that was happening, all the memories, you know, what exists there right now. And right now I'm finding myself back here thinking about these other questions that people pose to us every day through emails. How does it look? What should we do for the day after? It's very hard to follow Noor about this, but I just want to reflect on our profession, especially that Noor talked a little bit about what has been produced in this room, is about what do you, as teachers, as professionals, as practitioners, as students, it's very hard to answer the question. I know Mona said she wished she was a doctor. I don't know if I wish the same thing. It's very difficult, but actually every day I wake up and realize how central our profession is. I mean, everyone has to live in a space. Everyone has to live within walls. Everyone has to go home. Everyone has to go to a public space. Our profession is very central, whether you're an architect or a planner or a landscape architect, landscape planner. But the question remains, is that which vision, which futures, which paths, how do you live? How do you construct? What do you look, how do you read the past? How do you create the indigenous future within the dominance of a settler colonial? I live in the belly of the beast. I live in New York. You cannot say ceasefire in the university I come from. You cannot say decolonial. You stopped being able to say decolonial. You get subpoenaed for everything you talked about. So how can we think about what future we're going to build when we are actually all within this racial capitalist settler colonial system in the world that defines where money is coming from? So all these visions that we need to build, who's going to pay for them? How we're going to build this? Whose ideas are going to be built? We get these emails. I'm sure many of you here get these emails from all these like Norman Foster likes. Like, can you help us think about what Gaza is gonna look like? I was like, no, I'm not gonna help you. But then if I don't participate, or if we don't participate, whose future is gonna be built? And so these questions remain always very important. So for while our profession is not on the humanitarian emergency lines every day, except in what we're seeing as tents, etc., it's very central to human lives. But the question is always, it's a question of money, question of global order that suppresses any ways of thinking differently. For example, I was thinking, as Noor was speaking, about the future of our profession in terms of artificial intelligence, of new technologies. Who is going to decide on these technologies? How are these indigenous visions going to be part of this icon technology? I was trying something today with ChatGPT about, I read something by Noor before I came here about Gaza is a colony is a settler colony without colonial people, without settlers themselves. And so I asked ChatGPT, I was like, oh, so give me examples of other places like that. And they kept mentioning places, not Gaza. Then I said, is Gaza? They're like, no, Gaza is not like that because like you cannot eliminate the history of the Jewish people and the Israeli people that lived before that. And so it becomes a contestation over like whose histories that we're mapping, whose future, and then it's a contestation of who manages these IA algorithms that we're going to shape a lot of our knowledge and our students' knowledge on how we're going to practice in the world. Similarly, when we think about questions of property and decolonizing, so we talk a lot about when we think about decolonizing, we think about abolitionism, right? That we need to abolish the systems of properties and private properties that we discuss, what we usually think about when we think about the settler colonialism of the United States or Australia. But then if I go back to the question of Palestine, private property is at the center of actually rethinking how to bring back ideas of like Palestinian people before the Nakba. They used to live there. They used to have keys for these places. They used to have property titles. And therefore, abolition does not exist similarly everywhere. Because while in places like in the United States, I would think we need to abolish property. In the case of Palestine, decolonizing means dealing differently with property. But how? Which property? How can we think about property differently? How can we think about indigenous ways of life and property differently? So,
I'm not answering all of this.
no, these are not for you. This is for me. I was like, I can't even answer any of this. You made me think about this.
I can only do the last one.
You can? Okay, that's good. That's good. And also the other thing is that made me think about this is how we always think in the architecture and planning practice about process versus product. So, for example, when Noor was talking about the AUB students who proposed the village, rebuilding the village, she said they didn't propose a specific village because they were thinking that it's going to look like a settler village if they proposed it. It's going to look like an Israeli town if they built it. And so the problematic that we have to also think about is what kind of processes, how do we involve people in thinking about these futures, so we don't end up with the same, because the houses might look the same. I think this is something that we all have to think about in architecture and planning, is that they might quote unquote look the same, but the process of getting to a place must look different. And how does it look? How does this process look in a decolonized future towards liberatory futures? I'll stop there and then we can talk more. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiba. Noor, thank you so much. I've been looking forward to meeting you for quite a while, so that is essentially why I agreed to be a discussant, considering that I know nothing about what you're going to be talking about. However, the first thing I want to say is thank you very much for mentioning the work of Salman Abu Sitta, because we actually have all those archives now here at AUB in the Palestine Land Studies Center, but no one is using them. So I am going to take this opportunity to call upon all those present here to share and join in the work, not only in listening to Noor, but also in participating in creating the decolonized knowledge that is possible using all of those archives that we have. And these are living archives. They're not just boxes. And we have fantastic people, archivists, who are there waiting for just helping you and supporting you. And we've been, very instrumental in this week. Noor is essentially talking about a lot of the stuff, the philosophies that guide us in the center. So please do reach out as AUB, as people from outside AUB, to think of projects so that we can enrich this whole decolonizing actions by action, not only by listening, and for the future, not only in response to Gaza as Noor actually stated. So that was my first point. My second thing is that I've spent the best of the past 40 years thinking about food. I know many of you might also be saying the same thing, but I mean thinking about food in a different way, as a system that involves land and people and nature and ecologies, and of course mapping, because this is the basic of it. So, and the first time, but this whole idea of indigenous decolonizing mapping, this is not something we learn in faculties of agricultural and food sciences, right? This is something that perhaps recently in urban planning we're starting to look at, but this is not part at all of the bodies that brought us the Green Revolution. I'm not going to talk about the Green Revolution, but I can talk about it later if you're interested. So the first job I took when I completed my doctorate was something that didn't have anything to do with academia, because I couldn't, fathom living one more day into academia. So around in 1990, I ended up in a city in the south of Algeria. That's what we're coming to the point, called Tindouf, where I worked for a protracted period of time with the Sahrawi refugees that are part of the Polisario Front. And something struck me, my initiation to indigenous mapping, which was that there were 5 refugee camps distant from each other in the desert, the same distance that the 5 main towns of the Western Sahara are distant. So to travel from one to another, you needed to travel exactly the same time. The camps themselves, the Algerian authorities didn't allow building in hard, people needed to continue living in tents. But the tents were organized along streets that replicated exactly the cities that were there, and the camps were given the names of the major cities. That was a mapping on the ground, the recreation of all of these cities by people who had been expelled by settler colonial action, in order not only to show a map to their children, but also to make them live in a new place. That was extremely interesting, fascinating to me, because I was extremely active, and continue to be in Lebanon, in the Palestinian camps, but I had never, thought about this. The Palestinian camps in Lebanon have the names of the regions in Lebanon. And in fact, what happened is that the camps in Palestine, in Gaza in particular, are called after some of the camps in Lebanon. Tel el-Zatar is a camp in Gaza. So that had never been, we had never thought about it, perhaps because we thought always that we were going back imminently, and this was not part of why this was created. So this is, this was my immediate thought about it, and I wanted to ask you, Noor, now when we talk to talk a little bit more about this. The second issue that's interesting, and I'm going to talk more about Algeria if you allow me, because it's super interesting to me, probably for the same reason that it's interesting to you, is that truly the Algerians, the FLN, when it came, it divided the country into wilayat. However, it didn't depart, in my opinion, but then I want to hear your opinion, it didn't depart from the conceptualization of borders and lines and frontiers and state simplification for giving the ability to control. And today in Algeria, again, we can talk more about this, you have conflicts between what used to be tribal lands, because they don't belong. The concept of ownership of where you have extensive pastoralism is insane, it doesn't exist. While all of the lands belong to the army in the certain wilaya. So truly we have decolonized, but have we? And this, again, we're going to see it in many different places, which takes me to my last point in here, and I hope that's of interest, which is, of course, South Lebanon. Now, we think of South Lebanon today as a place that's bearing the brunt of, depending on who you are and what you think, but it is involved in fighting the settler colonial state. I don't know whether people like it or not, that's a different story. But this is the case, and it's been doing this for a very long time. There is a history in South Lebanon of doing that. I think probably very few people know in this room that South Lebanon is actually called Jabal Amel, like Akar is called Akar, and Al-Biqa' is called Al-Biqa', and Kisirwan is called Kisirwan. And I'm not going to continue because you know all of these districts, except for one place that has the name of a direction. It doesn't have the name that belongs to it. And this is something that poets in Jabal Amel, because there are many of them, have actually noted. And there's a very famous verse in which the poet says, the large mountain has swallowed the little mountain and gave it the name of a direction. And that also is an attempt at indigenously mapping. Now, of course, when the French colonizers took over this region, the South, and now we continue to call it the South because that's perfectly fine. The South was itself divided into different districts. And this one, I'm sure people don't know. So there are like 3 big districts in the South, in the same way as we have the Shuf al-Suwaijani that is still used. And there are Bilad Bshara, south of the Litani. No one ever hears about this. Aqlim al-Shumar, and the only one that we hear about is Aqlim al-Tiffah, for the very good reason that other cities that don't really belong to Jabal Amel are in this particular part. So that also is something on which we're falling back, we're falling behind on this whole idea, this whole concept that we can learn from the work of Noor, from the effort of decolonizing in applying it and implementing it in here. I could go on, but I think I'll bore you, and I want to hear what Noor has to say. So I'm going to give her the mic because it's her day. Thank you.
Wow, lots to think about. A few things. I mean, one, I'll just go in order. One of the interesting things that you mentioned, Hiba, is this question of private property, which I actually often get asked about in Q&As when I do the presentation that highlights Palestine open maps because as you look at the British survey maps, right, there is this question of how dynamic is this map, how static, how much of a snapshot of a particular period of time it is, also the question of who's doing the mapping, right? It's a British mapping, etc. But what's interesting is while certainly there is obviously this insistence of belonging and ownership that is tied to refugee right of return and so on, it is us who really project the private property sort of paradigm onto it. So if you look at the British mappings, or if you look at conceptualizations of how property was distributed in the villages قبل النكبة, there was a lot of shared ownership of land. And I'm not just talking about sort of the Ottoman structures of land ownership and taxing and so on, which is the source of a lot of sort of Israeli attempts at sort of delegitimizing, claims to Palestinian claims to land. But also, if you, for example, zoom in, go to Palestine Open Map, zoom in on Isdud, on my hometown, my family's village, right? It gives you this beautiful image of where the orange orchards were, and which parts of the land were growing tomatoes, and which parts were growing wheat, and so on. And that is accurate for the moment that the survey was conducted, right? But the way that growing crops in Isdud actually worked was, yes, al-Jawade, my family, the Judah family, right? We had land that was considered, Aradi al-Jawade. There was land that was Aradi Zakakte, like for the Zakut family, whatever. But we didn't ever really hardly planted on our own land. And so we were actually, it was some kind of mix of a sharecropping situation where people understood that the soil needed to be sort of revived with different plants, and they didn't want to have the specialty of having to actually be able to be as knowledgeable in wheat and tomatoes and oranges, etc. So if you were a family that mainly worked with wheat, you worked with wheat, but you did so on multiple other people's quote-unquote properties. And they came to you in off years, and they would plant oranges on your land and so on. And so, yes, there was this conception of ownership and private property to some degree, but the ways that it was activated within the community was very different. And so I think that there is plenty there for us to kind of go back and think about critically as we re-examine sort of potential of how to interrogate private property in sort of conversations around liberation. It's not perfect, but it's a starting point. I think also, so this question about that the students made about the settlement looking like a settlement, I think part of that has to do with layout. So actually, the first time I was ever in Lebanon, I was volunteering. I was teaching English in Shatila for a summer, and the organization that I was volunteering with, sorry.
We all started there. Sorry.
The organization that I was volunteering with took us, on a trip down to the south, Maroun and showed us, just some things. They were taking the volunteers out for a day, and before we had hit the border of occupied northern Palestine, I was sitting next to a Lebanese friend, and I said, "Oh, صلنا." And she was like, "No, I think it's still farther." And I was like, "No, I'm شايف البيوت الإسرائيلية." And she was like, "How can you recognize that that's?" And I was like, "Oh, I know what an Israeli settlement looks like." And she didn't believe me. And then 2 seconds later, the bus driver pulled over and was like, "Oh, we're at the Hudud." And she was like, "Oh my God, that is an Israeli settlement." I'm like, "Yeah, because they all look the same." And it's because there is no organic growth in the way that they're built. They are the definition of kind of this idea of you build a space, you import the people. There is no sense of community of how these places kind of grow. I mean, we look at a place like Beirut and we think, some newcomers or something, they may think, oh, it's chaotic, it's messy, it's this or that. But it's also reflective of of the history and of the experiences of the people and so on. And settlements to a large degree are not, right? And so I think this was the concern of the students, of let the layout of the village kind of come to be in that past, which I applaud them for very much. Your interest in food is one that I very much share. I love food. My dream project is to one day solve the mystery of why it is that بكل بلاد الشام somehow Gaza and Halab are the only ones that hung on to filfil properly. I can't find good shatta anywhere to save my life. If it's not my mom making shatta, I cannot get decent filfil في بلد عربي. It is so frustrating. Even North Africans with their harissa, none of it suffices. Any واحد غزاوي would be like, this is not filfil. لدرجة إنه when my mom went back to Gaza several years ago, she was so over making shatta with jalapenos and Mexican peppers, which we have an abundance of in the U.S., that she was, the U.S. Agriculture Department's nightmare, and brought back just bags of bizir. I'm like, oh my God, Mom, seriously, what if you got stops? Just every kind of heirloom seed from Gaza you could think of. And now there's just Gaza peppers spattered across parts of the U.S. from my mom handing out seeds. And she won't make shatta with anything that's not like filfil baladi min Gaza, because it just doesn't, right? It doesn't hit the same. But of all of the spice routes, right? I mean, the same spice route that goes through Gaza, goes through Nablus, goes through Al-Quds, goes through Damashq, goes through all of these other places historically. ليش غزة وحلب مسكوا بالفلفل and no one else did? ولا عمري حفهمها. But this is like the dream of my life is to figure. Yeah, but it's different filfil, right? But like, why Halab? I have to figure this out for Blad al-Sham, because the rest of the Levant is relatively mild food, right? Mediterranean, very mild. Why? يعني عملوا ملوخية في غزة. إذا على طاولة العشاء, if there is not a piece of filfil, like هالقد قطعة فلفل جنب الشوكة بزعلوا, like خناقات, like تقول يعني كأنه واحد يعني حكى إشي عن إسرائيل يعني, oh my God, توشة على الطاولة. It's like, why don't I have a filfil? You think I don't want filfil? I'm like, okay, just everyone breathe. So yeah, and I think what's interesting too is indigenous foodways are some of the most perfect windows that we have to look at history in really interesting ways. Bandora, or Banadora, as you say in Beirut, is such an integral part of our diet. And none of us had it in the Mediterranean until the 1400s, right? Until the Spanish and the colonizers, etc., landed in the Americas and brought Bandora back with them. I told my sister this recently. She didn't believe me. She was like, that's some nonsense TikTok video you saw. I was like, what are you talking about? I was like, this is an entire global history. She was like, I don't buy that we didn't have Bandora before. Think about Italian food. Think about the amount of tomatoes that we use. All of this is a result of native food from the Americas. So there's so many sort of stories there. I'll actually challenge you a bit on the Polisario camp thing.
Okay.
It's super, super interesting that they did that, but that's actually not the case. What you see in Lebanon is not the case in Gaza. So in Rafah, the camp my mom grew up in is Yibna camp, named after Yibna, after her mother's home village. So you do see that sort of geographic projection happen in Gaza, for example. Though it's not to that extent. I think it's incredible. I would love to read more about that. That they did it that detailed in that much of a manner in Tindouf. But you do see some of this in Gaza, where you know, يعني كل القرية like ضلت في نفس المكان بالمخيم, and they named it after the village. So those kind of presences, or it's colloquially, even if it's not formally named. Although if you follow the news closely on Gaza right now, you'll hear in قصف مخيم يبنى, like it's, you know, it's in the akhbar. But there's also a lot of colloquial references, you know, روحوا عند أهل المجدل للشمال, and it's like, you know, إنه أهل المجدل like all settled in this one area. Of course, now 75 years later, everyone has distributed throughout the strip, but initially speaking, that was present. And then finally, for the wilayat بالجزائر, I mean, yeah, absolutely, it's a beyond valid challenge to say that there is a lack of departure from really thinking critically about borders. They don't. But then post-independence, they don't critically think about borders the way we may want them to, but they do reconsider them for multiple other reasons. So they have two remappings post-independence, one that goes into, I believe, 31 wilayat, and then another, the final one that stuck, which is 44, I believe, now. And we know, or we should know, right, that maps always erase. For every map that shows us something, there's an erasure of something that's happening. And with the post-independence mappings, the questions becomes, what are you erasing now, right? So before, the French were erasing the Algerians, and then as the Algerians government sort of begins mapping, state mapping, then there's the question of where are the Amazigh? Where are they not? How are they shown? How are they not shown, right? So there are all these, there's always sort of an evolution of who's being erased and why at any given moment. And I think it's right on the money that we have to always keep that in the back of our heads and not romanticize any one given remapping as a better or truer version.
We have some time for a few questions. Thank you. We have some time for a few questions. So if can see a show of hands, I know there are soldiers who are ready to also carry the microphones. Maria, sorry, here. So we have Professor Najjar and then Dr. Sorry. I'm used to this. But, do you want to give? Do you want to give Dr. Sham? Please go ahead, Karim.
Thank you for this wonderful talk and for the presentation. It's really amazing. I have a question to the project you showed, the student project that won the award, and I find very interesting this dam that collects the water. And actually, you mentioned that they drowned the road, but actually they didn't, because there's still a tunnel that passes.
True.
So
their words, not mine, but true.
yeah, but I find this a very interesting moment, because actually it accepts kind of the connection still to another village from a village. So there is an acceptance in the presence also of the occupier, which becomes actually I wouldn't say dialogue, but becomes actually the essence of a design that goes into reality.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if there's kind of similar project, or what the project would look like if it wasn't just an infrastructure, which is easy to kind of question, but if this was also a settlement kind of.
Yeah. So as it stands right now, the competition is limiting largely to villages that have not been built over. So they are largely empty spaces. Which again is part of this attempt to engage in the discourse and conversation of and push back against Israeli arguments of a lack of space, all this kind of stuff, right? That said, there is a plan to move more into offering villages. So in any one given year, 20 or 30 villages you are allowed to choose from for the competition. And they did this because the first couple years when they had it open to all 400 village files or whatever, the same ones kept getting picked. And so they didn't want to keep repeating, there were popular ones around Al-Quds or Tantura or whatever that were in the news. And so they were like, okay, we have to kind of switch up the way that we do this. That said, there are other instances where you see some settlement building onto the land, and then there is that need for consideration. So the one that I wasn't able to share today that I also present on from time to time is a design of Al-Qastal, and the individual who won, Yasser, is from Jordan. Was Jama al-Urdaniya or a different Jama, I can't remember. But he had to account for this. And so then there was the question of, do we knock down any of these buildings? Do we incorporate these buildings? And his particular answer was a blend of the two. And there are other places we can look for questions like that. I mean, when the settlers pulled out of Gaza, there was that initial question of with Ahl Gaza of like, what are we thinking about with these settlements? Of course, a lot of that questioning, that answer was made for them. That decision was made for them because the settlers destroyed things as they left, right? So this is another thing. This is a claim that often gets made in Israeli sort of media and public. Not only, oh, we left and they could have done whatever, but we left them houses and we left them. I'm like, they took the houses on wheels on their way out and then they destroyed what was there. So there was some sort of infrastructure. But a lot of times, unfortunately, in these situations, answers or decisions are made for the population. And I asked, Abu Sitta, for example, with the competition, what about cities? I mean, Haifa, Yafa, what about cities? And he was like, it's a fair question, but shway. Like, basically, the answer was one thing at a time. Let's start the conversation with this, and then let's move into some of the more difficult stuff. I think that's a reality, but also understanding that part of this is about reviving rural relationships to cities, right? Because of course some people, there's massive urbanization, and so a lot of people are going to want to live in urban centers and not necessarily live in smaller villages. But part of this is also about reviving a social landscape that includes that thinks of things beyond the urban, and so there's no perfect answer, but I think that's those are the considerations that are being made.
Certainly, Dr. Shami.
Yeah, thank you for a great talk.
Thank you.
I'm hoping you can help me with something I struggle with the notion of indigeneity, which is how do you historicize indigeneity and how do you indigenize history? So as an example, the discussion you were having with Hiba about property, so you took, as you said, it's a moment in time that you can deal with, and you see mapping and counter mapping going on. If you go back, you're going to see other examples of mapping and counter mapping, and it's not modern states only or settler colonial states, it's empires imposing notions of property, imposing taxation on ownership, and so on.
Race was basically invented via mapping empire.
So, I mean, just even with property, there's a constant, especially in agricultural communities, because food production is so dependent on how you divide up land and so on. There's always attempts to what I know about Jordan and Palestine, there's attempts to circumvent, the boundaries that states have imposed on private property and so on, and musha systems and so on persist even if official registration of land has become private and so on. So, if you look at this long history of land use and this long history, centuries of different ways of defining property and rights to property and so on, does the concept of indigeneity do justice to that complexity? And I'd like to hear more about the Hawaiian example, actually, which
sure,
which might give us some clues there.
The very short answer is yes, I think it does. The longer answer is I think So I think it's very important in the same way that it is important to look at and incorporate settler colonies, for example, that don't fit into this British Dominion model, which is most of settler colonial studies is obsessed with, the US, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, etc. In the same way, I think indigeneity cannot be limited to questions of very exoticized and romanticized concepts of sort of traditional modes of living, whatever that means. The idea that Palestinians are any less indigenous because private property and capitalism existed in Palestine at the moment of initial Israeli invasion or Zionist invasion, right, is to me absurd and should be challenged in every possible way. And the same is true, I think, in Hawaii. If you look at Hawaii, actually, they have something called the Mehele, I think 1848 Mehele, which is it's an attempt, it's a land reform system. And you see privatization actually begin in Hawaii prior to the annexation and the illegal overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii. And it actually was largely because it had some unfortunate counter effects, but it was largely because the Kingdom of Hawaii recognized the invasion that was coming and the attempts that were coming. And so they wanted to ward off some ability to sort of cede land. And so you see these land reforms begin to happen in Hawaii. There are a lot of unfortunate effects of those land reforms. And so now as Native Hawaiians, as Kanaka Maoli look back, they use them in similar ways to Palestinians, in which they look to them to show kind of a history and prove genealogy of families, and at the same time politically and critically push back, right, that the land reforms also were a means by which that the kingdom imposed control and power on the population in a way that it did not itself ask for. Similar to, I would say, Palestinians with Ottoman Misha and so on, kind of organization. So, I mean, to be fair, I think your question has no perfect, simple answer, but I would say certainly that indigeneity and our conversations around indigeneity have to be centered in something that is more than trying to kind of romanticize or exoticize the idea of something that was pre-modern, right? Indigeneity and modernity should not be seen as counter-opposed, or as opposed to each other. I shouldn't say counter-opposed. So I think that that's very important. And I think that in the case of Palestine in particular, there's nothing wrong with having really, complex and nuanced conversations around indigeneity, in the same way that there is nothing wrong with, I think, really challenging all of these notions of how we decide to discuss or designate Algeria, for example. I mean, as a very young student in undergrad, I was baffled by the idea that anyone would debate whether or not Algeria was a settler colony. And then as I was exposed to sort of more literature and debates, I also still didn't understand it, because my response to it basically was, so what if it's complex? So what if it was also empire? So what if it was also this and also that? It doesn't negate something else, right? And so I think that very much ends up being the case with looking at places like Palestine and Hawaii, is that we have to embrace that it may have sort of multiple frameworks for us.
There's a question from a student in the back, so we're going to take Sarah's question before we close, because it's always... Thank you.
Oh, there's another one here, by the way.
It's okay. It's okay. Should I go or?
Hi. Thank you for this eye-opening lecture. So when you were presenting, you were speaking about settler colonialism. Like, of course, we think of Palestine, but one thing that also came to mind was the movie Avatar, which deals with themes of settler colonialism. And naturally, while watching, we all are on the side of the indigenous people and we all want them to have their land. And Avatar also happens to be the highest grossing movie of all time. And I find that a bit ironic, considering the fact that the Westerns are turning a blind eye on what's happening in Palestine. And so it raises a lot of questions into why do Westerns use these world problems for entertainment narratives instead of actually addressing them, and why do societies sympathize more with fictional characters rather than real-life documented evidence?
I'm not sure I can.
Let's take the second question to let you think a little bit about Sarah's
Sure.
question. She asked it to me this morning. I was unable to answer, so disclaimer.
That's a good one. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation, emotional and comprehensive. I have a comment and a question very quickly, and just briefly, something resonated with me on the issue of indigeneity and land distribution. I was walking with my dad this Sunday, and we were in the farm, and I was asking him about the borders of our land, and he's like, do you see that olive tree? And there are around like three or four groves of olive trees, and he's like, look over there, that's the border. I'm like, yeah, I cannot tell, and he just continued to tell me that everyone here knows the borders of their lands based on a number of olive trees, and this tradition isn't just the product of now, it's from the ancestors of his ancestors. And because I'm thankful for the fact that culturally it's still unacceptable to sell land in my village, that's why we still very much are protective of it. And I'm so very happy that this still exists. But just to tell you how much we do not have issues, they do not need maps. My father never faced an issue with his neighbor and land neighbor, and he is also a lawyer, so a lot of the villagers come to him, and there was never a case where someone says, oh no, I need this grove again. So we manage, because of our culture and our sense of community, we manage to make things work in an organic way. I have no clue why we have this obsession with making things to control things, just to make them look similar to each other, buildings, cities. I walk in my city and in my village, and this difference is beautiful to me. I walk in Paris, I see it for the first time, you're like, wow. For the second time, like, oh, I'm just seeing the same thing over and over and over again, until you go and turn a left and see the impoverished part, and you're like, oof, am I still in Paris? Anyway, that's just a brief comment, and it's a rant. Seventh wilaya, there you go. And my question is, very briefly, what do you think, we always have these debates about making decolonization less abstract, because whenever we have these discussions with my colleagues and research departments, it's always about decolonizing language, decolonizing systems of knowledge production, decolonizing everything, but talking about the land. So that's my question. Thank you.
Your questions, whether intentionally or not, go together a bit, which is, I mean, I don't think this is a be-all, end-all piece of wisdom. My personal opinion is that, films and metaphor, as the famous article goes of metaphors and abstractions make something easier sometimes to grasp, but it also makes it easier to dehumanize other people. It makes it easier to separate what you're watching in real life and what you are witnessing happen in the world from a film or a concept that you discuss in class, which is why it is so important to put ourselves constantly in the middle of the pain as much as we can, and to embrace the complexity and the difficulty and the sheer horror of some of what we see on a regular basis. The other side of that, question to you in regards to film is, okay, Avatar is really popular. You know what else is really popular? Westerns. The pioneer and the cowboy. That's also a huge part of American identity and pop culture. And the same is true for Australia and Canada and Israel and till this day, South Africa. So you can look at one side of pop culture, but you also have to look at the rest of it. Avatar was a hit, but they were blue people and we're rooting for them because they're the underdog in a movie. But America goes and invades countries and makes wars and decimates nations, and then asks us to go watch a film about the PTSD of its soldiers. And those are even higher grossing. So, there's a lot of ways to approach the film question, perhaps. I'm so glad to hear that your village is doing well and that your neighbors are getting along and there's a lack of dispute. People quote Robert Frost all the time that good fences make good neighbors. Nobody wants to talk about the fact that he was being ironic. He wasn't being literal, and people throw around this quote and don't give it any context. So yeah, there is a lot to be said sort of for these traditional or community paths of moving forward. How much of that is feasible, unfortunately, in a modern context, we will only, you and your family and neighbors will only come to see as time goes on. But I will say that a lot of questions around enclosure and threat and borders also have to do with threat, right? So as communities are more and more exposed to the threat of invasion and dispossession, our conceptualizations around these issues also change drastically. So who knows, for example, I'm not taking anything away from that, from your community, but who knows what the development around those conversations would have looked like had there been a direct confrontation, right, of someone trying to take the land. We really don't know. But we can look to other situations and see and learn from them, certainly.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a very, very inspiring first conversation and a fantastic introduction to the city debates. Thank you, Noor. Thank you, Rami. Thank you, Hiba. Thank you, everyone, for your great listening. We start again tomorrow at 9 a.m. We look forward to seeing you all. And please, let's give a hand of applause for our fantastic discussion.